encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Hello, and welcome to Wifey Wednesdays, a podcast for women who are seeking to be the best wives they can be. I'm your host, Emily Hatfield, and this is the show where the plan is always to do things God's way, especially our marriages. Now, if you are a YouTube watcher, then you're going to realize that I'm wearing the exact same outfit that I was last episode. I am recording these back to back because I'm going out of town, and I wanted to make sure that we were releasing on time. I'm trying to keep things, that I promised that I'm going to do. I'm going to try to follow through with those. I don't know. Maybe I'm feeling like the pressure of that from last week's episode. I don't know. But here you go. Thank you for joining us this week. We're going to be talking again, picking up where we left off in our discussion of the big story of the Bible, what we can learn from God and apply to our relationships. So last week we started with Abraham and Isaac, and this week we're going to look at Isaac as a grown man, having been spared as a sacrifice, and now living as the one through whom God's promise will continue. Isaac and his wife, Rebecca, have been blessed with two sons who could not be more different, and apparently this makes each child endeared to a different parent. Now, I get it. Having children of my own, two even, I can understand where different personalities do better with other personalities. Different children bond in different ways to each parent. And it seems that Isaac and Esau have a special relationship, and that Rebecca and Jacob have a special relationship. There's a lot to unpack in this story, and it's dramatic from the womb, really. And while we could spend a lot of time looking into the details and the deception and the unwise decisions, ultimately, what I want to focus on today is something that could very well rear its ugly head in our relationships, and something that should be avoided at all costs, and that is favoritism. With each parent having a favorite child, they formed alliances and ultimately teams within the family unit. Where Isaac and Rebecca should have been the team, it becomes Isaac and Esau versus Rebecca and Jacob. This favoritism ends up severing the tie between brothers, ends up separating Rebecca from Jacob, and must have caused anguish between Isaac and Rebecca. Can you imagine the scene as Esau is weeping and pleading for a blessing? It's heartbreaking. But this favoritism ruins a lot more than this family unit. Look at what it does to the next generation. Should Jacob have learned a lesson about favoritism from the train wreck that it produced in his life? Absolutely. Did he? No. And so Jacob also ends up picking a favorite son. And in picking a favorite son, he ends up making that son hated by all of the other brothers, except Benjamin, mistreated and cast aside. Besides the fact that we have no idea, how this favoritism is making Leah feel. That's not even included, but I can only imagine. It's not great. Whew. Aren't you thankful that your family isn't the only family that has been plagued by sin and generational trauma? Same. So what can we learn from this besides a whole lot? I think first we need to step back and see that while God has a chosen people, he still loves other people and treats them with love and kindness. I think about what little we know about Melchizedek from the story of Abraham. But obviously, God had other people that he was caring for and blessing. We simply need this narrative, this line of the story, because Jesus is coming from this line. I think about God's sending of Jonah to Nineveh to warn and save the Assyrians. Now, did you catch that? It's the Assyrians, right? People who are going to take Israel captive. But we know from the New Testament that God is not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to know Jesus and to repent. So, think about your family. Are there ways in which you seem to choose your children over your husband? Are there ways you've divided up your family and there's now friction? Does anyone get special treatment? Can you see growing resentment because of it? The covenant we made in marriage stands, regardless of whether you add children to your family or not. And so, just because you have added more people into your family doesn't mean that you should neglect the relationship that started it all. Didn't that really end up being the children of Israel's main problem throughout history? As they grew larger, they turned their attention inward and not upward. They stopped considering and honoring God and instead kept their focus on the things that they preferred in the present. You and I can get so focused on the chaos that is raising children that we neglect our marriages. We cannot get so focused on the task of teaching the statutes of God to our children that we neglect our own spiritual health and growth. We cannot get so focused on our children that we inadvertently make them idols in our lives instead of seeking God first and honoring Him above all. Now, it's hard. I get that. But Isaac and Rebekah's examples teach me that terrible things can come when I get things out of whack. When I put the wrong priority on things, it often backfires in a way that I never intended. Kind of like what ends up happening with Jacob and Joseph. What a grieved life Jacob ended up living. Obviously, certain personalities are going to function in a smoother way than others. And you know what? Sometimes that daddy's girl and mama's boy ideology is really true. But also, depending on the personality of the parent, the children may be drawn to one over the other. I get that. I see that. What I guess I'm trying to say is, as parents, we have the responsibility to be parents. And above that, before that, we have the responsibility to be a spouse. The marriage relationship is to be held in honor before all people. This relationship that we have is supposed to be mirroring the goodness of Christ and the church. Our marriages ought to be pointing people to Jesus. I don't want people to see my marriage and think, their life revolves around their kids. I want them to see that my life is all about Jesus, and that informs how I treat my spouse and how I train my children. That's the goal, and every day's a battle. Now, that's not always a daily reality. It takes work to put your marriage ahead of your children. Our society wants to place all emphasis on all things children. And you know what? Sometimes, so do things that are geared toward women. There are all kinds of things that focus on how to train your children and, how to do this or that and how to make your children your biggest work and all of that. And sometimes I'm afraid that what that's really doing is playing into making our world revolve around our children and getting our hopes and dreams tied up into their faithfulness and feeling defeated when our children, who are tiny people and people with souls that ultimately are going to make their own decisions, when they choose paths for themselves that are different than what they've been taught, we suddenly are crushed because our whole life has been them. But if we will stay focused in our marriages, showing the world and thus giving our children a front row seat to the fact that I want my marriage to reflect Jesus and the church. That as a wife, I want to submit to and honor and respect my husband as though I am submitting and honoring and respecting Christ. I want my children to see that the reason we do things is because we love Jesus. That we don't hide things from daddy, we don't undermine him, that they don't get to do whatever they feel like, and that I don't let them, one of them get away with one thing and the other not get to. We're consistent. We're trying to act like Jesus. It's a struggle, but most things worth something are. So, let's choose to model our lives after Jesus, who loved the apostles equally, so much so that none of them knew which would be the one to betray him that night in the garden. He'd washed all of their feet, right? Let's live lives that honor our spouses and respect our children, but don't revolve around them or let them interfere with our marriages. Let's honor God in our marriages and show the watching world how much we honor Jesus by the way we treat and talk about each other. Well, that's going to do it for today's episode. We're going to touch back on Jacob next week, but the favoritism aspect isn't really the direction we're going to go next week. So join me. We'll be back to Jacob, but it'll be something a little different. All right. We will continue on with our overview at lightning speed of the Old Testament and what we can apply to our lives as God's chosen people. Until then, remember, love God, love your husband.